On most old farms across the American Midwest, there's usually a well somewhere on the land. Sometimes it sits behind the barn, sometimes near the edge of a field. Many of those wells were abandoned decades ago, covered with wooden lids or sealed with concrete. But older farmers still say something about the ones that remain open. If an old well on your land still has a rope hanging down inside it, you should never lower that rope after midnight. Because sometimes something below the well will pull the rope back up. Daniel Harper's farm sat at the edge of a 200-acre cornfield. The farmhouse stood near a gravel road. A tractor shed rested to the west of the property, and the well sat behind the cornfield, near a row of old maple trees. Daniel discovered the well on the third day after moving in. He had been walking through the field checking irrigation lines. The corn plants were still short that time of year, green rows stretching toward the edge of the woods. In the open patch of ground behind the field, Daniel noticed a round concrete ring rising from the dirt. It was the mouth of the well. A wooden lid rested loosely beside it. A thick rope was tied to a metal bar above the opening. The rope disappeared down into darkness. Daniel leaned forward and looked inside. The bottom was impossible to see. He dropped a small stone. 1 second, 2, 3, almost 4 seconds later, a faint splash echoed from somewhere far below. The well was deeper than he expected. Daniel grabbed the rope and pulled. It was heavy, very heavy, as if something large was tied to the other end. He pulled again. The rope moved slightly, then stopped. Daniel frowned. Maybe the metal bucket at the bottom had rusted into the mud, but he didn't worry much about it. Old farms always had broken things lying around. Daniel placed the wooden lid back over the opening, then walked back toward the house. That night, the farm was unusually quiet. No wind, no insects. The cornfield behind the house stood perfectly still. Daniel slept deeply until a strange sound woke him. A slow, scraping noise, like rope sliding across metal. Creak, creak. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at the clock. 2:48 a.m. The sound came again. Creak, creak, like someone slowly pulling a heavy rope upward. Daniel sat up in bed and listened carefully. The sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from the field, from the direction of the well. Daniel walked to the window and looked outside. The cornfield was completely dark, but at the far end of the field, something was moving. A rope, slowly rising from the mouth of the well, a little more each second, as if something below was climbing up. Daniel stood by the window for a long time. The rope behind the cornfield was still moving, not quickly, not violently. Just slow, steady pulls, like someone deep below the well was dragging it upward, one section at a time. Daniel narrowed his eyes, trying to see more clearly. The cornfield was dark. No lights, no movement, but the rope continued to rise. Creak, creak. The metal bar above the well groaned softly each time the rope slid over it. A cold uneasiness crept along Daniel's spine. The nearest neighbor lived almost a mile away. There was no reason for anyone to be standing out in the field at this hour. And yet the rope was still moving. Slowly, deliberately. Daniel put on his jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The night air was damp and cold. The ground felt soft beneath his boots from the evening dew. He walked through the rows of corn. The leaves brushed quietly against his coat as he passed. The closer he got, the louder the sound became. Creak, creak. Daniel stopped when he was about 30 feet from the well. The rope was moving, but there was no one there. No figure standing beside the well. No shadows. Only the dark opening in the ground, and the rope sliding slowly upward. Daniel took a few more careful steps. The moment he did, the rope stopped. The field went completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Daniel aimed the flashlight down into the well. The beam revealed the damp concrete rings lining the shaft, one circle after another, descending into darkness. Then the light disappeared into black. Daniel grabbed the rope and pulled gently. It felt heavier than it had during the day, heavy enough that he needed both hands. But this time, the rope slid upward easily, as if whatever had been pulling it had suddenly let go. Daniel hauled the rope higher, a few feet at a time. Then he stopped. A rusted metal bucket appeared at the mouth of the well. The bucket was old, wet, dripping dark water onto the dirt. Daniel set it down beside the opening. Inside the bucket there was no clear water, only thick black mud. And something else. Something that made Daniel freeze. A handprint, pressed into the wet mud inside the bucket. It wasn't his hand. The print was smaller, but the fingers were strangely long, as if they had been stretched. Daniel swallowed hard. He shined the flashlight down into the well again. This time he noticed something new. Along the concrete wall were thin, wet streaks. Not streaks of water running downward, but streaks moving upward. Long, dragging marks, like wet hands, had been climbing slowly toward the surface. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the video. The shape beneath the water had moved, slowly, deliberately, and the rope in his hand had twitched, like something below had grabbed it. He told himself there had to be a normal explanation. A large branch, a trapped animal, maybe even drifting debris from the underground tunnel the old man in town had mentioned. But the feeling in his chest refused to disappear. That night, Daniel returned to the well. The cornfield was quiet again. The sky above the farm completely dark. No wind, no insects, just the distant hum of electricity from the farmhouse. Daniel brought a stronger flashlight this time, and a small camera from his truck. If something was moving in the well, he wanted proof. Daniel removed the wooden cover and set it aside. The opening of the well stared up at him like a black hole in the ground. He tied the camera securely to the end of the rope, double knotting it so it couldn't slip loose. Then he slowly lowered it into the darkness. The rope slid downward along the metal bar, the camera spinning gently as it descended. The flashlight beam followed the concrete rings of the shaft, each layer darker than the last. 10 feet, 20, 30. Finally, the surface of the water appeared again, a black mirror reflecting the small light of the camera. Daniel lowered it a little further. The camera touched the water. Small ripples spread across the surface. Then the lens slipped beneath. The water swallowed the light, turning everything murky and gray. Daniel waited, holding the rope steady. Seconds passed, maybe 20, maybe 30. Then he began pulling the rope back up, slowly, carefully. The camera rose through the shaft again, water dripping from the lens. When it finally reached the surface, Daniel untied it and checked the recording. The video began with the concrete walls sliding past the camera, just as expected. Then the water appeared, dark and still. The camera dipped beneath the surface, the light cutting through cloudy water. At first, there was nothing, just drifting sediment and shadows. Then the image changed. Daniel paused the video, leaning closer to the screen. Something large was moving in the water, a shadow far deeper than the beam of the light could reach. It shifted slowly, like a long shape sliding through the darkness. Daniel rewound the footage and watched again. The shadow moved once more, closer this time. And suddenly, the entire frame jerked violently. Daniel stared at the screen. At the exact same moment in the video, he remembered the feeling in his hand, the sudden tug on the rope, like something below had grabbed it. Daniel lowered the camera from his face and looked down into the well again. The surface of the water was perfectly still, but as he stood there, the rope in his hand twitched. A small movement, then another, slow, deliberate, like something far below was holding the rope again. Daniel tried not to think about the video for the rest of the day. He told himself the shadow in the water could have been anything. A fallen branch, a piece of debris drifting through the underground tunnel. Old wells often connected to natural caverns beneath farmland. At least, that's what he kept telling himself. But every time he remembered the sudden jerk in the rope, the uneasy feeling returned. That night, the wind was stronger. The cornfield behind the house swayed slowly in the dark. Daniel was lying in bed when he heard the sound again. Creak, creak. Rope scraping against metal. Daniel opened his eyes and checked the clock. 2:51 a.m. The sound came again. Creak, creak. Slow, heavy, exactly like the night before. Daniel sat up and grabbed his flashlight. He didn't bother convincing himself it was nothing this time. He already knew where the sound was coming from. The well. The air outside was cold and damp. The cornfield stood dark beneath the sky. Daniel walked between the rows of plants toward the open ground behind the field. The sound grew louder with every step. Creak, creak. The rope was moving again, but this time it was rising faster. Sections of rope sliding quickly over the metal bar, like something below was climbing the rope. Daniel stepped out of the cornfield and into the clearing. His flashlight beam landed directly on the well. The rope was moving, but no one stood beside it. No shadow, no figure. Only the dark mouth of the well, and the rope sliding steadily upward. Daniel moved closer, carefully. When he was only a few feet away, the rope suddenly stopped. The field fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Daniel aimed the flashlight down into the well. Nothing moved, only darkness. He grabbed the rope and pulled. It was heavier than before, much heavier. Daniel pulled harder, slowly lifting whatever was tied to the end. A few feet of rope rose from the opening. Then something appeared. It wasn't the metal bucket, and it wasn't just the rope. Another length of rope had been tied into a thick knot, old, soaked with water. Daniel frowned. The rope dripped onto the dirt, dark water soaking into the ground. He shined the flashlight closer, and that was when he saw it. Handprints, several of them, pressed into the wet rope. Dark streaks of mud where fingers had gripped tightly, as if something had been climbing the rope, hand over hand. Daniel let go of the rope. It dropped back against the side of the well. Then his flashlight moved across the wooden cover lying beside the opening. And Daniel froze. A fresh, wet handprint covered the surface of the wood. It hadn't been there earlier. The mark stretched across the lid, as if something had reached out of the well and placed its hand on the ground. Daniel stood beside the well for several minutes without moving. The wet handprint on the wooden lid glistened in the beam of his flashlight, water still dripping slowly from the rope, falling into the dirt beside the well. The print was wrong. The fingers were too long, too thin, almost as if they had been stretched while gripping the rope. Daniel slowly placed the wooden lid back over the opening. He didn't try to pull the rope again. He simply stepped away from the well and walked back toward the house. The next morning, Daniel drove into town. The town was small. One gas station, one grocery store, and an old cafe beside the highway. Daniel asked about the farm. He mentioned the well behind the cornfield. The man behind the counter stared at him for a moment. Then he asked quietly, "You found that well already?" Daniel nodded. The man leaned back in his chair, silent for several seconds. Then he said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "That well wasn't dug for water." More than 40 years earlier, the farmer who owned the land had hired a crew to dig deeper wells. The water table across the county had begun to fall. But when the workers dug far enough down, they broke into something unexpected. A hollow space beneath the farmland, a natural tunnel running underground. Water from that tunnel slowly filled the bottom of the well. One of the workers claimed he could hear sounds coming from inside that tunnel. Not flowing water. Something moving. Something dragging itself through the dark. A few days later, the worker disappeared. The rope used to lower the bucket was found lying in the well, but the bucket itself was never recovered. After that, the farmer sealed the well and told everyone to stay away from it. Daniel returned to the farm that afternoon. The cornfield behind the house moved gently in the wind. He walked back to the clearing behind the field. The well sat there exactly as before, the wooden lid resting over the opening. Everything looked normal. Daniel lifted the lid slightly and looked inside. The rope hung motionless, disappearing into darkness. The handprint was gone, as if it had never been there. Daniel never used the well again. He tied the rope tightly around the metal bar, secured the wooden lid in place, and left it there, at the edge of the cornfield. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, Daniel wakes up to a familiar sound, a slow, scraping noise, rope sliding across metal. Creak, creak, like something deep inside the well is slowly pulling itself upward. And the thought that frightens Daniel the most is not what might still be down there, but something else. If the well is only 50 meters deep, then where does that thing stand once it reaches the top?